Welcome to the New Brunswick Chamber Orchestra's presentation of Rejected. This is a fun-filled salon. It's sort of an informal gathering of music. Instead of hearing stuff in chronological order, I like to mix and match pieces. You'll hear pieces where I start maybe with the fourth movement of a work, followed by the third movement of another work. And they're all connected with a theme. Today's theme is Rejected. So all the composers on this program have had, in some way or other, a bad day or two, as you'll hear quite a bit more about. Obviously, this salon couldn't happen without our wonderful players, so before I go much further, let me introduce our wonderful quartet. So we have Ru Tao Mao on first violin, James Keane on second violin. Over there in the corner, we have Jordan Enzinger on cello, and we have Jordan Fusco on viola. I'm Mark Hitchko, and I'm the artistic director of the New Brunswick Chamber Orchestra. Give ourselves a round of applause, yeah. Today we're joined by a special guest, Chuck Schneider, who will be singing for us as well. You'll see quite a bit of him. He's in the back of the room, so I'll wait for him to come on up before we get started. The first thing that you're going to hear on the program is part of a cycle of pieces written by the New York City composer Alicia Liu. And she wrote a fun set of songs called Everyone's a Critic, in which she took excerpts from criticisms of famous composers' works and set it to music to the actual composer's work itself. So it's kind of a lighthearted, tongue-in-cheek reflection on what sometimes can be incorrect perceptions of a work when it was first premiered. So I thought it'd be fun for us to get started by me reading the actual text that you'll be hearing in the piece that Alicia set to music. And so see if you can figure out who the composer is or what the work is that's being discussed. So the first work you're going to hear Chuck sing today is set this way. Opinions are much divided concerning the merits of this symphony of this composer's, though very few deny that it is much too long. The Andante alone is upwards of a quarter of an hour, and being a series of repetitions, might be subjected to abridgment without any violations of justice, either to the composer or his hearers.
Opinions are much divided concerning the merits of the pastoral symphony of Beethoven, though very few deny that it is much too long. The Andante alone is upwards of a quarter of an hour in performance, and in being a series of repetitions might be subjected to abridgment without any violation of justice, either to the composer or his hearers.
Charming criticism of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony was written in 1823 and published in the Harmonicon in London of June of that year. So sometimes showing you that even a great composer like Beethoven had his critics, right? So the first work we're about to hear is written by a composer who's really not known for chamber music so much, but primarily known for his compositions for piano. The Russian composer Sergei Rachmaninoff is a standard bearer of virtuosic pianist literature, and his work is performed constantly, and throughout the concert season you could be planning to hear one of his great concertos or certainly solo works of his somewhere. Pretty much any day of the week you could expect to hear it somewhere in the world someone's playing Rachmaninoff. However, it might not have been had it not been for a series of circumstances. Now, I'll just give you a little bit about Rachmaninoff. He was born into a fairly well-off family and had the luxury of having a live-in tutor who taught him music. So he exhibited quite a bit of talent at a young age, and he had daily lessons, and so went off to conservatory at a fairly young age, which was fairly common in those days, to study the art of composition and also to study piano. Now, he exhibited quite a prodigious amount of talent as a virtuosic pianist, and was really encouraged to pursue a career as a solo pianist. He was also interested in composition at the same time, and so he always struggled with this dual sort of struggle between a career in the composition world versus a career as a solo pianist. And in fact, the later portion of his life, he barely composed at all because he was so busy concertizing his own music, as it turns out. Well, at the end of the conservatory, it was kind of a requirement for you to write a large work. And sort of a coming out project, a sort of coming of age a work that a composer would put together would be his first symphony. And obviously this is a very daunting task to put your name onto something as profound as a symphony. But he went ahead and wrote this first work and was going to have it premiered. And sent it to a famous conductor in the area who agreed to have it performed on him. And this name is quite familiar to musicians. Alexander Glazunov agreed to perform his first symphony on a work of his. The only problem was that Alexander Glazunov was a bit of a heavy drinker and had a habit of getting completely hammered in rehearsal and in performance. And so we're not really sure whether or not it was a fault of the actual composition that wasn't really that great, or if in fact was that Glazunov was just loaded the entire time. He was having a rehearsal, and when he got to the performance, he was completely soused and wasn't able to make sense of anything. So what we do know is that the critics did not receive it terribly kindly, and I believe that these delightful words encapsulate it well. It was compared to the 7 plagues of Egypt and suggested that Rachmaninoff's first symphony would be best admired by the inmates in a conservatory in hell. So you can see that he probably didn't take that terribly well. I don't think anyone actually would. And it actually launched him into a very severe depression, of which he didn't write another work for 4 years or so. And might not have ever written another note again had it not been for the development of a sort of a new style of medical treatment, which was therapy. And so there was a friend of the family that happens to have studied about Freud and psychotherapy and hypnotherapy, which is really quite prevalent now, or increasing in prevalence in the early 19th century. And so someone suggested that Rachmaninoff might benefit from going to talk about these issues with this person. And so for the period of about 3 or 4 months, he ended up doing so. He went on a daily basis where he talked about what he was going through and underwent hypnotherapy as well. And at the end of it, he was transformed. What we do know is that he was so ecstatic with his newfound confidence that he started writing again. And in fact, he wrote what was at that point his 2nd major work for piano and orchestra, and dedicated it to his therapist. And as we all know now, Rachmaninoff's 2nd piano concerto is probably his single most famous work, and is, as I was saying earlier, a work that you can pretty much guarantee is going to be heard in concert halls almost anywhere in the world on any given day of the week. It's probably being performed somewhere. So, as I said, going from the depths of that darkness, from being rejected. So, the first work we're about to hear with the string quartet is an early work of his. It actually dates from right before he wrote this first symphony that was quite the debacle. It's his 2nd string quartet. And they're not really quite complete. He wrote 2 of them, but both of them only have 2 movements. So they're considered student works that were kind of not fully fleshed out because they were incomplete. But this is titled his second. And I think you can really get a sense for his style of writing, and certainly I don't think that you have to be in hell to enjoy what you're about to hear. I think it's rather divine and very fitting for our space that we're in. So this is the first movement of his second string quartet. The next work we're about to hear from News Everyone's a Critic cycle has this text. The composer of this opera is nowhere deep. His passionateness is all on the surface. The general effect of the work is artificial and insincere. Of melody, as the term's generally understood, there is but little. The air is the only bit of tune in the opera, and it scarcely rises above the vulgarity of Offenbach. He aimed at originality, and he undoubtedly obtained it, but he obtained monotony at the same time.
Is artificial and insincere. Of melody, as pretend generally understood, there is but little. The air of the time is the only bit of tune in the opera, and it scarcely rises above the vulgarity of Offenbach. It scarcely rises above the vulgarity of Offenbach. He's aimed at originality, and he undoubtedly obtained it, but he obtained monotony at the same time. But he obtained monotony.
The next composer we're about to discuss is a very unfamiliar name, actually so unfamiliar that I had never even heard of him before looking up this project. A composer by the name of Hans Roth. Who's ever heard of that? No, right, exactly. So Hans Roth was a contemporary of Brahms and Bruckner, German composer in the late 19th century. Born to a family of actors, both his parents, his mother was a dramatic actor and his father was a comedic actor. Both of them tragically died when he was a young teen, so he was orphaned in his teens, but found solace in music and went off, like Rachmaninoff, went off to early studies at conservatory. And it was at the Vienna Conservatory where he discovered composition and really started focusing on that as a craft. Unfortunately, he didn't really get such a great reception. He had a great admirer in the form of Bruckner, who really took Hans Roth in and thought his talent was quite immense and deserved cultivation. The problem for Roth was that Bruckner was at odds with the other major figure at the time at the conservatory, a man by the name of Johannes Brahms. And as we all know who won in the sort of historical cage battle, Brahms won hands down. And so even at that time, Brahms had quite a bit of sway and impact, and unfortunately Hans Roth suffered quite tragically as a result of this. So this story is, I have to say, it's kind of hilarious and also tragic at the same time. More tragic than hilarious, but you'll see what I'm saying. So, as I was saying with Rachmaninoff, at the end of your first degree, you were required to put together a large project, a compositional project, and Rachmaninoff and others published their first symphony and sought to make their name that way. And Hans Roth was no different. So at the end of his training, he finally put pen to paper and created his first symphony. And took the draft and brought it to the jury at the school, who was quite dismissive of it, in fact, save for Bruckner. So then he brings it to Brahms, and Brahms looks over the draft of the first symphony and says this helpful advice to poor Roth. He says, Yeah, he has no talent whatsoever and should give up music entirely. So that unfortunately did not help Rott at all. Now, as it turns out, he was also suffering with mental illness, and this seems to have triggered a kind of a break for Rott. And he started to suffer from paranoid delusions, and Brahms figures quite significantly in these delusions of his. And this ends, which is where the tragic but also kind of funny part is. About 5 or 6 months later, he's on a train going somewhere, and a fellow passenger proceeds to begin to light up a cigar. At which point, Hans Rott brandishes a pistol and insists that the passenger extinguish the cigar because Johannes Brahms had apparently laden the train with dynamite. And the lighting of the cigar was going to ignite them and blow them all up. And so poor Rott was taken away and sent to an institution. And at that time, the treatments weren't really very sophisticated. And so unfortunately for Rott, he spent the remainder of his years in a psychiatric institution, where he died tragically only about 3 or 4 years later at the very young age of 27. So we don't really have much of Hans Rott's music. We have that first symphony, and we have a couple of other student works of his, but they're really quite lovely. And in fact, the first symphony is so impressive, it's now being performed somewhat, although it took many years for it to even get recorded for the first time. Only in the last decade or so was there even a recording issued of his first and only symphony. But there are string quartets as well, and we would love to perform one for you. But unfortunately, the global supply issues that seem to be suffering everywhere have cut into our ability to do so, and we've been rejected. We cannot actually perform it because we ordered this piece about 2 months ago, and it's still somewhere in Germany and has not been sent. So we thought we would just do justice to poor Rott by doing a work by his biggest supporter, Johannes Brahms. And so we're in fact going to be performing the one of the only 3-string quartets that Johannes Brahms ever wrote. And the work we're about to hear comes from about 2 years before Hans Rott wrote that first symphony of his. Now Brahms, like many, hesitated before writing a string quartet. And that's because if you have to put yourself in the mindset of a 19th century German composer, there is one large figure that looms over the entire landscape for both symphonic writing and string quartet writing, and that is Beethoven, right, exactly. And Beethoven's testament of string quartets was sort of seen as the culmination of the art form. And so many composers, even to this day, hesitate to write their first string quartet because they have that specter of these great giants behind them. And so Brahms, although he was very well respected and quite an accomplished composer in his own right, didn't actually dabble with the string quartet form until the 1850s, when he was already a mature composer in his own right. And he only attempted to write 3 works, sort of in a period of a couple of years, and published them all together as a set. And then never returned to the form, although you can hear the mastery in this small excerpt we're about to hear. So we're going to hear the 3rd movement of his first string quartet. And this traditionally would be the scherzo movement. And the scherzo movement is typically a lighthearted presentation and a little bit of a dance. This is a little bit darker because it's in minor, but also at the very end he'll twist it and you'll hear that sort of brief glimpse of sunshine coming out. But what marks this particular movement is fascinating is that the middle section, which is known as the trio section, features an extended usage of a particular technique, an extended technique for the string players called bariolage. And this is in which the string player uses the bow to cross 2 strings to create the same pitch. One on an open string and the other one using the fingers on the string. And so you'll get quite a sort of an interesting sort of tremolo effect. And that will be featured primarily by the viola and second violinist. And so I've asked the first violinist and the cellist to play really quietly during that part so you can really hear it. So this is not Hans Rott, this is a Johannes Brahms first string quartet. next work from Alicia Liu's Everyone's a Critic goes this way. When this composer has an opera to compose, he waits patiently until the midnight bell has tolled. He then enters his study, in which there is a piano placed between a big drum and cymbals. And seating himself at the piano, he first bangs the drum on the right hand, and then crashes the cymbals on the left hand, then thumps the piano in the middle. And while the air is reverberating with the mingled sounds, he commences with the first chorus. This is the way he composes. Can anyone have doubt on the subject?
When Verdi has an opera to compose, he waits patiently until the midnight bell has tolled. He then enters his study, in which there is a piano placed between a big drum and cymbals. And seating himself at the piano, he first bangs the drum in the right hand, then crashes the cymbals in his left hand, then thumps the piano in the middle, and while the air is reverberating with the mingled sounds, he commences the first chorus. This is the way Verdi composes. Can anybody have doubt on the subject?
That charming review came from Dwight's Journal of Music and was published in June of 1853. So, everyone's got candies and chips and crackers and bags and things, and it's okay for this next piece. I know in classical music we're usually very concerned about not making any noise and being very, very prim and proper, but our next composer would be totally okay with that. And the composer I'm talking about is John Cage. Now, Cage is probably not a name that's familiar to everybody, but to musicians, he is a profound name and probably single-handedly the most influential composer of the 20th century. Now, that is a large claim to make, that you are the most profound composer. But the reality is that Cage sort of redefines what it is to write music, and in fact, what music even is. So he didn't even identify himself as a composer. He called himself an inventor of sounds. And that's true throughout all of his works. Cage took things to a level that had never been done before. So for example, rather than writing a work for the piano, he thought, what if I were to alter the sounds of the piano? What if the pianist were, instead of playing the notes on the piano, to reach inside and pluck the strings of the piano with their hand? What if I were to take a screw and put it between some of the strings? What would that sound like? What would it sound like if I put thumbtacks in the hammers of the hammers and really altered the entire sound of what it means to even be a piano? And so works for prepared piano is what they're called, were revolutionary in the fact that the piano was being used in a completely different way than had ever been done before. Now, Cage didn't come there overnight. In fact, his experiences and exploration came through kind of a lifetime of exploring. As a young man, he was very talented and very gifted in a lot of different fields. He was a brilliant mind who was a capable mathematician and did some work as a mathematician. And as I said, he tinkered. His father was an inventor as well. But also he was a great artist in his own right and had a successful career as an artist, as an art critic, as a writer, and then started doing some work with music. He traveled around Europe after deciding that college wasn't really for him. He tried for one semester and then decided that the college really didn't know what it was doing and just left and decided instead to travel Europe and explore life as a musician, as an artist, as an inventor of sounds. Came back home and decided to study formally a little bit more because he became interested in composition in a sort of more focused way. At that time, there was a very famous composer who had set up shop in LA. and his name was Arnold Schoenberg. A name who is at this point very famous. He was the beginner of the Second Viennese School, had turned music on its head in its own right. But Schoenberg was the opposite of what I'm saying Cage is. Schoenberg had very clear, defined rules as to what could be done with music, and so invented a very complicated system of what's called dodecaphonic music, or 12-tone writing, in which all of the 12 pitches are carefully organized, and each pitch must be performed once before anyone can be repeated, and then there's very clear rules governing how those pitches are to be used. Well, Cage decides to approach Schoenberg for some instructions and for lessons, and then at that point, Schoenberg, who was very world-renowned, told him what his hourly rate was, and it was virtually impossible for the young Cage to be able to afford. So when Cage balked, Schoenberg responded by saying something very interesting, because it had a profound influence on Cage for the remainder of his life. Schoenberg said, "Listen, young man, do you plan to devote yourself to the art of composition and to the art of music?" To which John Cage unequivocally says, "Yes, I commit myself to that." So Schoenberg said, "Fine, I'll teach you for free, so long as you abide by that commitment." And so he did. He actually taught Cage for the next 3 or 4 years. And Cage, to his credit, abided by that commitment well after he was successful and did not need to compose another note. He continued to compose almost on a daily basis. And once he was interviewed, he was asked, like as an elder statesman of the musician's world, why he continued to do so when he really didn't need to at that point. And he said to honor that commitment that Schoenberg had made and that commitment that he had made those years ago. So they had a falling out, though, because their personalities were just so different. Whereas Schoenberg was very strictly governing what the rules were of how you could write, Cage was interested in going outside of those rules. And in fact started exploring not only what could happen if you put thumbtacks in pianos, but also what would happen if I, as the composer, didn't even control the way the music was going to sound. And started to explore what's called aleatory music, or aleatorical music, or music by chance, in which the chance of, say, rolling a dice or turning a page to a book and using that page to dictate what notes will be put in the play, played, or even allowing the players to decide what notes they choose to play. He decided to explore all these options, and in fact broke open all of those sounds and all those possibilities for later composers. It goes even beyond that, because the stuff that he did started to break open things to, like, what even is music? And this most famous composition is probably half gimmick, but half profound. The single most influential piece of the 20th century was a piece that nothing happened. And actually, I have a copy of the score right here. In 1952, John Cage performed his new work, which he was calling a thing on silence. He decided to have a pianist come out and perform on stage in a three-movement work for piano. And the pianist comes out on the stage and proceeded to sit down at the piano, open the piano lid, and do nothing for approximately 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And the question is, put yourself in that situation. Put yourself in Woodstock in 1952, imagining you're about to hear a work by this young composer, and instead you have a pianist sitting on the stage for 4 minutes and 33 seconds doing absolutely nothing. What do you suppose you would do? Probably move awkwardly for a little bit, cough, shuffle your feet. And what do you think about it? Like, the seconds are ticking by really slowly. 30 seconds goes by, a minute goes by, 2 minutes have gone by, nothing is happening. This guy is sitting up there doing nothing, right? People start to get uncomfortable and start to rustle around. In fact, people started to not really even know what was going on. Is this a scam? Am I being gimmicked? That piece, at the end of it, they had a sort of a let's talk about our feelings kind of thing. And one of the audience members got up and said, "Good people at Woodstock, let's drive these guys the hell out of town." Because they thought that this is ridiculous, right? But that's precisely the point, which is why I said the bags of chips are totally appropriate for the music we're doing, because John Cage was interested in the actual response of the audience, not what the performer was doing. The audience unwittingly was the performer in that piece. And it just opens up the possibilities of what even is music. Well, if the shuffling of feet and the uncomfortable coughing can be music, well then certainly anything can be, right? And so that concept that anything goes, that anything can be considered music, is what's profound. And that influences all of music that follows. And not classical music, all music. You couldn't have the Beatles, you couldn't have Frank Zappa, you couldn't have Captain Beefheart and the Trout Replica Mask and whatever the hell is going on in that album. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go home and listen to it. People started exploring all sorts of progressive ideas, leading to a whole movement called prog rock, right? Progressive rock, where people start using found sounds in their tapes. And how do I know that they were influenced by John Cage? Because they tell us they were. Those composers, those artists, they were influenced by Stockhausen, by Cage, by all of these guys, and brought it into popular music and changed the sound of music for all of us, not just for classical music. So, going back to my first statement, John Cage, was he the most profound composer of the 20th century? Yeah, probably, because he opened the possibilities of what could be with music. The work we're about to hear is actually right before this time period. This was written in the early 1950s, and it actually is the last work that is not completely written by chance, meaning that this is the last work that John Cage puts pen to paper and dictates exactly what notes the players will be performing. It's from a string quartet called String Quartet in 4 Parts. This will be the first movement. And as I said, John Cage was interested in silence, as I was telling you with this work. This work really explores that. You will hear various sounds that are organized very carefully by Cage, but they're not organized in a traditional sense. You might hear a sound that sounds tonal and then a sound that doesn't sound tonal right next to it. And what Cage is exploring is the sound of that silence, the sound of those two sounds near each other, the beauty of one maybe and the dissonance of the other, and how they juxtapose onto each other. So this is the first movement of his string quartet in 4 parts, known as Quietly Flowing Along. honest to goodness, at one of our performances of that exact work, a cannon started going off. We were at East Jersey Old Town, and there was a reenactment going on outside the window, and a cannon was firing off. And it was, I thought John Cage would have greatly appreciated that. The introduction and finale to this work are the very extremes of modern extravagance and willfulness in the spasmodic strife to the original in music. In its expression, its reiterated restless, fruitless, and yearning and monotonous chromatic wail, we find it simply dreary and impossible.
Introduction and finale to Wagner's Tristan and Isolde are the very extremes of the modern extravagance and willfulness in the spasmodic strife to be original in music. In its expression, it's reiterated, restless, fruitless, and yearning, and monotonous, chromatic wail. We find it simply dreary and impossible.
So that quote comes from, yet again, Dwight's Journal of Music, published in Boston, this time in January 1875 to, of course, Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. The next work we're about to hear is from a composer whose story to me is just awesome. It's just a great, great tale. The name Leos Janáček is not exactly a name that's common to most people, but he's sort of a B-lister, very important, but not like the name that you're going to see on every program. But his life story is really quite fascinating. He was a Czech composer, grew up in a rural part of the Czech Republic, and studied early on and came back to his hometown of Brno and became a fairly successful local school teacher in a local music school. Became the director of the local conservatory there in town and educated generations of kids going through the program, but was also interested in composition and was trying to make a break, like many composers, and was continually frustrated by the fact that no matter what he seemed to write, it was performed locally but never got outside of just his local area. And I think this is a story that resonates with composers nowadays and has throughout the century. So his lack of recognition just frustrated him for the greater part of his life. And really, this was Janacek's existence. He married, had children, and lived a fairly stable, good life, but we might not know about him. He might have been one of the countless thousands of composers that have lived and died in relative obscurity, were it not for a chance encounter in his 60s. And this chance encounter just opened the floodgates for Janacek. It so happened he was on vacation when he was looking out over the town square, and a younger woman walked by. And when I say younger, I mean, he's like in his 60s, and she's like in her 20s. And she walks by, and he becomes entranced with her. And when I say entranced, I mean like obsessed about her. Her name was Kamila Stoslova. And by all accounts, she was a very beautiful young lady, almost 40 years his younger, but he really could not get enough of Stoslova, to the point where nowadays we would probably have a court restraining order against Janacek. But at that time, those rules weren't in place. I mean, she was happily married, also with children of her own, and he just could not stop thinking about her. And whatever was going on in Janacek's mind, it just opened the floodgates. So he starts writing work after work, thinking about Kamila. And his work is radically different. And suddenly it's invigorating. There's passion. There's all these unexpected things that are going on in the music. And there's just a flowering of creativity by this, elder statesman in this area. And now people start paying attention. And it's the works that are written in the last 10 years of his life, in his 60s and 70s, that Janacek is really known for. And it's because of the influence of Kamila, right? And he says, literally, that every note he writes is about her. So, the opera, The Cunning Little Vixen, guess who that is, right? The Macropolis case, the Glagolithic Mass, all of these works, she figures predominantly in all of them. And they're getting noticed, and suddenly his work starts getting performed outside of his local area, and he starts becoming recognized as a genius, because he really is. And you will hear that in this next work. Now, when I say that he was obsessed, at that time, you couldn't really text emojis to your lover, right? Or send pics. You had to send letters. And so Janacek dutifully did. She never wrote him back. So how many letters did he? Well, he sent her a letter almost every single day of his life, in the end of his life. Over 730 of these letters survive. And we know there might have been more, and she sent none. We don't know what she felt about the guy, but just that alone tells you what I think the dynamic is. Thus, that's why she's on the program Rejected, right? So this guy is obsessed with her. We know that she must have been humoring this because at his deathbed, she was actually present. So she clearly did actually feel an affinity for the old man, even though I think it was probably with some degree of, what is this? What's going on here? But we do know that it influenced his music profoundly, especially this next work we're about to hear. This is Janacek's second string quartet, and once again, we know it's about Kamila because he calls it Intimate Letters because of the letters he's writing to her. And guess what? He actually says that in this work, you will hear Kamila figure preeminently, because the very first phrase, you'll hear our lovely violist, Jordan, is going to be playing Kamila today. And you will hear the melody that spells out Kamila in that line, and then it's taken by the other players of the quartet, and you hear the passion, the eagerness, the frustration, all of the surge of emotions that are going on in Janacek's addled mind are present in this piece. And it's for that we're thankful, because it is refreshing, it's shocking, it's amazing. This is Janacek's Intimate Letters. back to Everyone's a Critic. The Paleozoic crawl turned into tone with all the resource of the modern orchestra, clamored for attention at the orchestral concert when this work was given its first airing on this side of the vast Atlantic. It was the primitive run riot, almost formless and without definite tonality, save for the insistently beating rhythms that made the tom-tom melodies of the gentle Congo tribes seem super sophisticated in comparison.
Spring was given its first airing on this vast side of the Atlantic. Was the primitive run almost formless and without definite tonality, save for insistently beating rhythms that made the tom-tom melodies of the gentle Congo tribe seem super sophisticated in comparison.
Our last work today is by the greatest reject of them all on the program. And it's a name you actually probably know and recognize, but probably didn't realize he was quite the flunky. Maurice Ravel is synonymous with French Impressionism and is certainly a name that is greatly respected and obviously treasured as one of the great French composers of the early 20th century. But not so much when he was a kid, right? He failed out of conservatory like 3 times. Yeah, so much like all these other young promising composers, he entered Paris Conservatoire when he was a young man and studied there. And much like a sort of graduate and undergraduate program, you could sort of stay for many years and reapply if you didn't make it. So he was admitted first in 1889 as a young 14-year-old, but then he was expelled in 1895. But then, 2 years later, he reapplies again, and 3 years later, he's kicked out once more. And as part of the conservatory regimen, you have to write works that meet the approval of the jury. It's not very dissimilar to the exams that any modern, conservatory student has to take. And so we've heard how these first symphonies can sort of get met with derision. Poor Hans Rott and Rachmaninoff. And Ravel, as it seems, was no stranger to this as well. Well, like any good conservatory or any good music school, you have lots of warring factions on the faculty, and it seems that Ravel was on the wrong side of this. So the big annual prize that every young composer would apply for was a composition work program called the Prix de Rome. And that's a name that might ring a bell for some people. This is a highly coveted prize, and it allowed the winner to receive a all-expense-paid trip to Italy, where they would put you up literally in an apartment overlooking the Spanish Steps. You can actually still see it to this day. Pretty sweet gig if you can get it, right? And so, of course, people would apply, and you would go and study in Italy for a year. And so Maurice Ravel applied for the Prix de Rome, and he first time didn't get it, second time Didn't get it. The third time failed that one. He applied 5 times and got rejected every single time. But Ravel keeps on fighting, right? He keeps on going. That's the one thing about his story, is that he's got, you know, the kids are calling it grit now, right? He keeps on writing, and he doesn't let it stop him. So the last time he applied, right, he is just about to turn 30, which is when the cutoff is for this prize. And at this point, he's already getting some international acclaim. People are starting to talk about Ravel. His works are being performed outside of Paris, outside of music schools, and he's getting quite a bit of respect. And so it seems unusual that in his 5th and final time for auditioning for this prize, he gets thrown out in the first round. So the Parisian newspapers are like, hey, what's that all about? So they start an investigation. And wouldn't you know it, the only people who advanced to the 2nd and final round were the students of the jury panel. So that, of course, led to quite the scandal. And actually, it broke open and it caused quite the national furor. And they tossed out the director of the conservatory and cleaned house at the conservatory as well. A bunch of the faculty were fired as a direct result of Ravel's getting rejected so many times. One of the pieces that did not fare so well was this string quartet you're about to hear. It is his only string quartet, and it's considered it's like a staple of the repertoire. It's a canon, and it's a phenomenal work. You're about to hear the final movement of this string quartet. And it's interesting because when it was first premiered, it was described as weird. That was the actual criticism here. Weird harmonic eccentricities. And that was how the critics sort of panned it in that panel. So here is the weird, eccentric, harmonic eccentricities of Ravel's string quartet. I'm surprised they didn't complain about the meter in that as well as the weird harmonies, which is a great segue to our next criticism, which is our final work on the program. This is the final work in the song cycle by Alicia Liu, Everyone's a Critic. And the text is, "The oddity of this symphony is the scherzo, allegro con grazia, which goes throughout in 5/4 time. This disagreeable meter upsets both the listener and the player. In his scherzo, this discomfort is quite unnecessary. The movement can, without the least inconvenience, be rearranged in 6/8 time."
Discomfort is quite unnecessary.